Dear listeners, a new day and a new story to discuss. Today, I'm going to tell you a story that interests me. Listen and write down what you think about this situation. I'm interested in your opinions. I remember the night I first doubted her, as if it were yesterday. We've been married for 5 years marked by laughter, dreams, and trust. Trust, that fragile thread, so easily snapped. It was a small thing, really. She started coming home late, her explanations too rehearsed. Her perfume, mixed with a scent not my own, clung to her like a guilty shadow. I asked, and she laughed it off, saying I was being paranoid. One evening, she got a message and I saw her screen light up. The name Mark flashed briefly. When I inquired, her face turned pale, then red, and she snapped, saying it was just a coworker. But her voice, it trembled like a scared child's. It was around 11 p.m. when she returned home that night, the night when my suspicions first took a dark turn. The sound of her keys fumbling at the door was like an alarm going off in my head. She entered, draped in her elegant office attire, looking a bit too composed. Another late night? I asked, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the edge in my own voice. She smiled, a weary, forced curve of her lips. Yes, the Henderson project is killing me. You know how it is. I nodded, pretending to believe. We sat down for a late dinner, mostly in silence. I couldn't stop thinking about the message I'd seen, Mark. Every bite I took felt tasteless, every glance I stole at her, heavy with unspoken questions. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. I watched her eyes flicker with something I couldn't read before she silenced it quickly. Who's that? I found myself asking. Just an email from the office, she replied, but her fingers shook slightly as she placed the phone back down. I wanted to believe her, to shrug off the gnawing doubts in my mind. But as we went to bed, her distant back turned to me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering. The next morning, I rose early, haunted by unrest and suspicion. As she showered, I couldn't resist the urge any longer. I picked up her phone. Just as I did, a new message popped up. Can't wait for tonight. Yesterday was incredible. My heart stopped. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was real, tangible. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I had to know more. That day, I left work early, driven by a single thought, to follow her. I parked a block away from her office at the time she usually left. The wait felt endless, every second stretching out torturously. Then, finally, I saw her. She wasn't alone. A man, tall, with a confident stride, was laughing at something she said. They got into a car together, his arm finding its way too comfortably around her shoulder. I followed them, my mind racing, heart pounding against my chest like a frantic drum. They stopped at a cozy, secluded restaurant, the kind we used to go to when we first met. I watched them from across the street, my world crumbling with every affectionate gesture they shared, every smile that used to be mine. As they left the restaurant, walking closely, lost in their own world, a sense of despair engulfed me. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I sat there, in my car, feeling a part of me wither and die. I must have lost track of time because, by the time I returned to my senses, they were gone. The street was dark, the restaurant closed. I drove home in a daze, the image of them together seared into my mind. As I entered our now too quiet house, her absence was like a physical weight. My heart ached, not just from betrayal, but from the loss of the life I thought we had, the future I believed was ours. I sat alone in the dark, waiting, wondering, drowning in a sea of doubts and heartache. She returned home later, her smile faded, her eyes avoiding mine. How was your night? I asked, my voice hollow. Fine, just fine, she replied, but her voice was distant, like she was talking from a far-off place. I nodded, the lies hanging between us, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to confront her, to unleash the storm inside me. But I stayed silent, the words trapped in a throat tight with grief. That night, I realized the truth was just the beginning. The journey ahead was unknown, treacherous. But I knew I had to face it to uncover the reality behind the facade we'd been living. My suspicions confirmed, but my heart shattered. I braced myself for what was to come. Days turned into weeks. Her phone became a fortress, guarded with a new password. Late nights at the office became routine. I felt the gap between us widen, like a chasm I couldn't bridge. One of my friends, Jake, saw her one night at a bar. Not alone, no, but laughing intimately with someone. He didn't want to tell me, but he felt he had to. Just thought you should know, man, he said, his eyes heavy with unspoken pity. I confronted her. We fought, a clashing of anger and denial. She accused me of not trusting her, of suffocating her with my insecurities. I wanted to believe her, to grasp at the straws of our crumbling relationship. The days that followed were a blur of feigned normalcy and internal turmoil. Each morning, we'd wake up as if nothing had changed, yet the air was thick with unspoken truths. I watched her closely, noting every hasty text, every secretive smile she thought I didn't see. One Tuesday evening, as I was rummaging through the attic for some old paperwork, I stumbled upon a stack of photo albums. Each album was a chronicle of our life together, filled with memories of better, happier times. Flipping through them, a sense of melancholy gripped me. It was then I noticed something odd, a small, hidden compartment at the back of the shelf. Curious, I reached in and found a burner phone. My heart pounded as I turned it on. It was protected by a passcode, but driven by a desperate hunch, I typed in her birthday. It clicked open. The messages I found were like a knife twisting in my gut. Intimate conversations, date plans, all with M. That evening when she came home, my mind was a whirlwind of anger and despair. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside. She looked at me, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "What about?" Her attempt at innocence was almost convincing. "I know about Mark," I said, watching her closely. She froze, then let out a shaky laugh. "Mark? Who's Mark?" She tried to deflect. "Don't play dumb," I snapped, the pain and rage boiling over. "I've seen the messages, Sarah." Her face crumbled, the facade breaking. I can explain," she stammered, tears starting to form. "Explain? How can you explain betrayal?" My voice rose, a crescendo of broken trust. She started to cry, her words a jumbled mess of excuses and pleas. But I couldn't listen anymore. The woman I loved, the woman I trusted, was a stranger before me. The following days were a torment. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. My work suffered, my world reduced to the constant, haunting images of her infidelity. I confided in Jake, my closest friend, over drinks at a dimly lit bar. "I just don't know what to do anymore," I admitted, the weight of my sadness heavy in my voice. Jake, always the pragmatic one, suggested I confront Mark. "Find out who this guy really is," he said with a steely edge. The idea took root. I needed answers, needed to face the man who had invaded my life. I started to watch her more closely, waiting for an opportunity. It came one Thursday. She mentioned a work event that evening, something she had to attend alone. I knew it was a lie. As she left, dressed a bit too carefully, I waited a few minutes and then followed her. My heart raced as I tailed her car to a high-end restaurant downtown. I watched from a distance as she met Mark, the two of them cozy and laughing as they walked in. Taking a deep breath, I approached the restaurant. The hostess looked up as I entered, a question in her eyes. "I'm here to meet a friend," I said, scanning the room until I found them. As I walked towards their table, every step felt like wading through quicksand. They hadn't seen me yet, engrossed in their own private world. "Sarah," I said, my voice louder than I intended. They both turned, shock written across their faces. Mark, a tall, slick-looking guy with a too-perfect smile, looked from Sarah to me, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice cool. "I'm her husband," I said, the words like shards of glass in my mouth. The confrontation was heated, accusations and denials thrown like punches. People stared, whispers fluttering around us like vultures. Finally, I left them there, their protestations and apologies fading behind me. The night air was cold against my flushed face. I felt exposed, raw, my pain on public display. The gathering storm within me had broken, leaving in its wake a landscape of confusion and heartbreak. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling. The house was dark and empty when I arrived. It felt like a mausoleum, a tomb for all the love and trust that had died. I sat in the silence, alone with my thoughts, the storm raging on. I couldn't let it go. The seed of suspicion had rooted deeply within me. So I did something I never thought I would. I followed her one evening. My heart pounded in my chest, a drumbeat of fear and anticipation. I saw them together, her and this stranger, laughing just like she used to laugh with me. They entered a hotel, and that image burned into my memory, an unerasable scar. I confronted her again, this time with the truth. The room filled with a deafening silence before she spoke. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you." Her words, meant to comfort, felt like daggers. In the wake of that disastrous confrontation, the house felt even more like a prison, the walls echoing with the remnants of our broken vows. The following day, she didn't come home. Calls went straight to voicemail, messages remained unanswered. Her absence was a gaping hole, an unending question that consumed me. I couldn't sit idly, couldn't let the unanswered questions gnaw at me. I decided to visit Mark's workplace, a sleek advertising agency downtown. My heart was a pounding drum as I walked through those glass doors, every step fueled by a mix of dread and determination. At the reception, I asked for Mark under the guise of a potential client. The receptionist, a young woman with sharp eyes, glanced at me suspiciously but made the call. A few tense minutes later, Mark appeared. His expression was a mix of surprise and annoyance. "What do you want?" he asked bluntly, once we were in the privacy of a meeting room. "I want to know what's going on between you and my wife," I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark leaned back in his chair, a picture of arrogance. "That's between me and her. You should be talking to your wife, not me." His dismissiveness enraged me, but I kept my composure. "She's my wife, Mark. You're wrecking a marriage." He smirked, a cold, humorless gesture. "Maybe your marriage was already wrecked before I came into the picture. Ever thought of that?" His words hit like a slap. I stood up, fists clenched, the room swirling with a mix of fury and despair. But then, something shifted in Mark's expression, a fleeting look of guilt that he quickly masked. "You don't know the whole story," he said, his voice softer now. "What do you mean?" I asked, my anger mixed with confusion. Mark sighed, looking out the window. "Look, I might have stepped over a line, but your wife, she's been unhappy for a long time." His words were a punch to the gut. Unhappy? Why hadn't she said anything? Why had she chosen this deceit? "Talk to her," Mark continued, standing up. "You need to hear it from her." I left the agency in a daze, my thoughts a whirlwind. I needed answers, and there was only one place left to find them. I drove to her sister's house, suspecting she might have sought refuge there. Her sister, Eliza, opened the door, her face etched with concern. "She's here, but she's a mess," she warned me before leading the way. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. The sight of her, so vulnerable, so broken, tugged at something deep inside me. "Why, Sarah?" was all I could manage, my voice barely a whisper. She looked up, her lips trembling. "I never meant to hurt you," she began, her voice a broken whisper. I felt so alone, so trapped in our life. I lost myself, and Mark, he was just an escape. Her confession was a storm I wasn't prepared for. Words and emotions clashed, revelations that shook the very foundation of what I believed our life was. "But why didn't you talk to me?" I asked, my heart aching with every word. "I thought I could handle it. I thought it would pass. But one thing led to another and—" Her voice trailed off, lost in a sea of tears and regret. The room filled with a heavy silence, the air thick with words we couldn't voice. I sat down, the weight of our fractured reality pressing down on me. We talked for hours, unpacking years of unspoken fears and hidden resentments. As I left her sister's house, the night was dark, the stars hidden behind clouds. The truth was out, raw and painful. But it was just the beginning. The path to healing, to forgiveness, or perhaps to an end, was unclear, shrouded in the fog of pain and betrayal. I drove home, the roads empty, my mind a maze of conflicted emotions. The truth had been unveiled, but it left behind a trail of questions, of doubts about the future and what it held for us. The storm within me raged on, a tempest of heartache and indecision, as I navigated the dark roads leading back to an uncertain tomorrow. We'd signed a prenup, a wedding contract. Just a formality, we'd said then. Now, it was a document of defeat. Our agreement had been clear. Infidelity would have legal consequences. She pleaded with me to reconsider, to think of what we had, of love that once was. But what is love, when laced with betrayal? I met with my lawyer, a stern-faced woman who spoke in firm, clipped tones. "We have a strong case," she said. I only felt hollow. The legal proceedings began. The courtroom was cold, sterile. She looked smaller somehow, her eyes filled with tears I couldn't decipher. In the days that followed, the house became a battleground of emotions, sorrow, regret, and a haunting sense of loss. We moved around each other like ghosts, our interactions hollow and strained. The silence was a constant reminder of the chasm that had opened between us. I buried myself in work, trying to escape the turmoil at home. But the distraction was temporary. Every evening, I returned to the stark reality of our fractured marriage. One evening, as I was leafing through some old documents in my study, I stumbled upon our wedding contract. The elegant script, the promises we had made, it seemed like a document from another lifetime. I traced the words with my finger, each vow a stark reminder of how far we had drifted. Just then, Sarah walked in. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. She held an envelope in her hand, which she handed to me with a resigned look. I opened it to find legal papers, a request for a separation agreement. My heart sank. The formality of the document, the clinical words detailing the end of our union, was jarring. "Why?" was all I could muster, my voice choked with emotion. Sarah sat down, looking weary. "I can't live in this limbo, trapped in guilt and sadness. I think we need time apart to figure things out." Her words, though calm, sent waves of panic through me. "Is this really what you want?" "I don't know what I want anymore," she confessed, her eyes brimming with tears. "But this isn't living. We're just hurting each other more." I read through the papers, each clause a nail in the coffin of our marriage. Anger, pain, and disbelief churned within me. But amidst the turmoil, there was a small, faint voice of reason. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps a separation was the only way to find some clarity. We spent the night talking, really talking for the first time in years. Old grievances were aired, apologies made, but the chasm remained. By morning, we had reached an unspoken agreement. We would go through with the separation, giving each other space to heal and contemplate our future. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Lawyers were consulted, assets divided, and living arrangements made. I found a small apartment close to work, a stark, impersonal place that reflected the state of my life. The day I moved out, Sarah helped me pack my things. We worked in silence, the air heavy with unspoken words. As I loaded the last box into my car, she spoke up. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted it to come to this." I looked at her, the familiar contours of her face now etched with sorrow and regret. "I know," I replied, my own voice thick with emotion. "I just wish we could have fixed things before they got this far." We stood there, in the doorway of the home we had built together, now just a house filled with memories and ghosts of a happier past. The finality of the moment was overwhelming. Driving away, I couldn't help but glance back at the house, the place that had been my home, my sanctuary. Now, it was just a symbol of all that had been lost. The contract of our marriage, once sacred, now broken, just like the vows we had once so fervently made. Settling into my new apartment was like navigating a foreign land. The walls were bare, the spaces empty, a stark contrast to the warm, lived-in feel of my former home. Nights were the hardest, the silence oppressive, my thoughts unrelenting. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself at a crossroads. The initial storm of pain and betrayal had settled into a dull ache, a constant reminder of my new reality. Yet, there was a growing sense of freedom, a chance to rediscover who I was outside of my failed marriage. I started to venture out, exploring the city, trying new activities. I joined a gym, started attending a local book club, even took up painting, something I had always wanted to try. Slowly, I was piecing together a new life, filling the void left by Sarah's absence with experiences and new acquaintances. Yet, amidst the newfound independence, there was an undercurrent of unease. The separation, meant to be a time of reflection, was fast becoming a chasm too wide to bridge. Calls with Sarah were polite, but distant. We were like strangers, awkward and unsure around each other. One late autumn evening, while I was walking back from a painting class, my phone rang. It was Jake, his voice urgent. "Hey, have you spoken to Sarah recently? There's something you need to know," he said, a note of concern in his voice. "No, what's going on?" I asked, my heart starting to race. "It's about Mark. He's not who you think he is." "I've been doing some digging," Jake replied, the words tumbling out. I stopped in my tracks, my mind reeling. "What do you mean?" Jake's next words were like a sledgehammer, shattering the fragile semblance of peace I had built. Mark's past, his intentions, the truth about his involvement with Sarah, everything was not as it seemed. As I stood there, the cold wind biting at my skin, a new storm began to brew, one that threatened to upend everything all over again. The broken contract of my marriage was just the beginning. The path ahead was fraught with revelations and decisions, each step leading me further into the unknown. The divorce was finalized. The settlement was in my favor, but what did it matter? Money can't mend a broken heart. Our house, once filled with laughter and dreams, now echoed with the ghost of our past. I often think back to those happy years, wondering where we lost our way. People say time heals all wounds, but some scars remain tender to the touch. In the end, I learned that love is fragile, trust even more so. I moved forward, one step at a time, hoping one day to find trust again. Not just in someone else, but in myself, to give my heart another chance to love, to live, despite the risks. And so, life goes on, with its twists and turns, teaching me that even in betrayal, there's a lesson to be learned, a strength to be gained. My suspicions were confirmed, but maybe, just maybe, I'll find a way to rebuild, to trust, to love again. Jake's words echoed in my mind as I raced back to my apartment, the revelation about Mark igniting a firestorm of thoughts. He's got a history of this, man. He targets vulnerable women, gets what he wants, and then disappears. I got proof, Jake had said, promising to send the details over. Back at my place, I paced restlessly, waiting for Jake's promised email. When it finally pinged through, I devoured the contents. Photos, texts, and even statements from other women. Mark's past was a sordid trail of deception and manipulation. The realization that Sarah could be his latest victim twisted my insides with a cocktail of fury and fear. I knew I had to confront her, but the thought of seeing her, of reopening barely healed wounds, was daunting. After an agonizing internal debate, I decided to meet her the next day at our favorite coffee shop, neutral territory for what I anticipated would be an emotional confrontation. The morning was gray and overcast, mirroring the turmoil within me. I arrived early, clutching the printouts from Jake like a lifeline. When Sarah walked in, her face lighting up upon seeing me, my heart clenched. She looked fragile, almost ethereal, so removed from the chaos of our current situation. After initial awkward exchanges, I dove straight in. "Sarah, we need to talk about Mark," I said, my voice firm. Her expression shifted from surprise to guardedness. "What about him?" I handed her the papers, watching her face as she scanned the damning evidence. Shock, disbelief, and then fear flickered across her features. "This can't be true," she whispered, looking up at me, her eyes searching for some kind of denial. "But it is," I replied gently. "He's been playing you, us. I can't believe it either, but we need to face this." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I feel so stupid," she murmured, her voice breaking. I reached across the table, covering her hands with mine, the connection both familiar and foreign. "You're not stupid, Sarah. He's the one at fault, not you." We talked for hours, piecing together Mark's deceitful web and how it had ensnared us both. The coffee shop buzzed around us, but we were in our own bubble, navigating a sea of betrayal and hurt. As we parted, a tentative understanding hung between us. We were still separated, still broken, but there was a newfound bond in our shared victimhood and in facing the truth about Mark. In the weeks that followed, life took on a surreal quality. Sarah and I teamed up, confronting Mark and eventually seeing him face the repercussions of his actions. It was a small victory, but it felt hollow. The damage he had inflicted went deep, reopening questions about trust, love, and our future. One evening, as autumn deepened and the leaves turned a fiery orange, Sarah and I met again at the park where we used to walk hand in hand. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of winter. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, looking out over the lake, where the reflection of the sunset danced on the rippling surface. I pondered her question, the myriad of emotions swirling within me. "I don't know, Sarah. I'm still hurt, still angry. But I also miss you, the old you, the us before all this." She nodded, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "I miss us too, but I'm not the same person anymore. None of this can be undone." Her words rang true. The ordeal had changed us both, perhaps irrevocably. We stood side by side in comfortable silence, lost in our thoughts. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, we knew that the journey ahead was ours to take, together or apart. The aftermath of Mark's deceit, the broken contract of our marriage, had set us on paths we never expected to walk. Our story, like life, was without a neat conclusion. It was a mosaic of experiences, some painful, some joyful, each shaping us in ways we couldn't yet fully understand. As we walked back through the park, the fallen leaves crunching underfoot, a sense of bittersweet acceptance settled within me. Whatever the future held, it was a road I would have to walk, one day at a time, each step a story in itself.